I'm Dana Perino, and this is Perino on Politics. The dust is starting to settle. Both major parties have their tickets set for the 2024 presidential election. But on the eve of the Democratic National Convention, what does the polling tell us about the state of the race right now? Welcome to Perino on Politics, where I call my smart friends up and find out what's on their minds about the state of American politics. And joining me on the podcast today with a look at issues that the voters will think about this year is my friend, senior political strategist with Bracewell LLP, Liam Donovan. Liam, welcome to Perino on Politics.
Dan, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. I am excited for this because I knew I was going to use you to get me up to speed because I took last week off, even though I read the news, but I didn't talk about it for a week. So I thought, oh, this is great. I can call Liam and he'll tell me everything I need to know for the week. And then I find out you were also off last week.
I was off last week, but that said, and I honestly think that taking a step back and getting out of the sort of the frenzy, unplugging from the matrix for a week actually probably gives you a better perspective on where things are than getting caught up in the day to day.
I was going to say the same thing. I feel like because I didn't have to talk about it constantly, I felt like I could think a little bit more and have a better perspective. Okay, so it's not the blind leading the blind. This is Liam and Dana's new, fresh perspective on 2024.
I think that's exactly right.
Okay, so why don't we just start there? We did just release today, it's Monday, August 12th. We just released the Fox News Power Rankings, and it shows a pretty tight race. We talked about the Senate races today. It does look like Republicans, just because the way the map is set up, will take the majority, perhaps getting up to 54 seats. The best case scenario for Democrats looks like a tied Senate 50-50 with whoever the vice president is settling those ties. So that was our take. President Trump looks to still be in the lead slightly in some of the battleground states, not all necessarily. Kamala Harris is gaining. And I'd just love to get your take on where do you think things are today?
Yeah, I think that is all a good place to start. And you mentioned the Senate first, and because that's my background a little bit on the campaign side. I think that's correct in terms of the floor for Republicans and the ceiling for Democrats, in the sense that even if Harris has a really good night, it's very hard to see them doing any better than the 50 that we sort of, that's kind of where we keep it right now, because the Democrats have 51. They give back the one in West Virginia. That's just a gimme. It's a pickup for Jim Justice, the governor there. Which is to say, if Trump wins, that's enough for a majority for Republicans. Trying to keep Montana and Ohio was going to be difficult in any event. I do think even a joyful ticket of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, which might help them in a lot of places, that doesn't help in Montana. That doesn't help in Ohio. In some ways, it actually syncs it up more with the top of the ticket than you could imagine, perhaps with Biden. That's going to be really tough to hold. And I think while 54 might be a lot, that would take a really good night from Donald Trump. I think it's easy to see Republicans get 51, 52. If they don't, it's a huge disappointment. That said, with this class in particular, Republicans have been snake bitten. And so you never know. But Sheehy in particular is pulling really well. Bernie Moreno in Ohio has a little bit tougher time, but they've kind of laid low. And I think the truth about the Senate map and the presidential in a lot of ways is the powder's very dry. And until Labor Day, I don't think they're really going to lean in on the paid media and really the sprint to the finish line. So Senate feels very good for Republicans. The House is going to be tied very much to the top of the ticket. The question of the presidential race is very much up in the air. And I think, I would have told you coming out of the swap, 3 weeks ago, it was a pure reset, that really Harris is just kind of looking like Biden did before the swoon, before the debate. I don't know that it's fair to characterize it that way anymore. Harris is looking strong. They are sort of untested. They are able to just kind of ride on the good vibes right now. That won't last forever. But remember, on an 85-day sprint at this point, they don't need it to last for long. And they're going to go in and out of news cycles that are favorable to them just by virtue of having a week of a big celebration there in Chicago, which looked at for a moment like that was going to be very rough for Democrats. So I think it's going to get worse for Republicans before it gets better. That said, this is still a 50-50 race by any measure. And I think in part because Republicans got so psyched out by 3 weeks of just everything was going their way. It's Republicans aren't used to having the refs on their side. You're not used to having the media sort of holding the other side to account. And I think got a little bit spoiled there. I think really, unfortunately, wasted 3 weeks that could have been used to hammer a message home against Kamala Harris, and instead kind of lick their wounds for a while in a way that's not helped them.
I know. I was thinking, I was like, get up off the mat. What's going on? But I also think the media, my goodness, guys. Finally, you saw today, like the Washington Post editorial board saying, Madam Vice President, you do actually have to take some questions. Here's some questions we would like to ask you. I call it the hiding in plain sight campaign. And then I see today that Time Magazine and The Atlantic both put Kamala Harris on the cover for this week. And I thought, guys, there's still 9 weeks until the election. Couldn't we put Simone Biles on the cover, or maybe, the U.S. Olympians, the whole team? Like America did so well in the Olympics, but it's almost as if the media is not even trying. And you and I've been in political communications for a long time. Like, I can't imagine as a spokesperson believing that something that I said that fundamentally changed my boss's position on an issue would be accepted. For example, if I said, "Oh no, I'm not against my Congressman Schaefer. He is no longer against fracking." Cool, and walk away. What do you think's happening there?
The credulity with which the media is taking those statements at face value. Okay, fair enough. I think that's just the nature of the game in some ways, and I think every Republican communications professional sort of would smirk knowingly at that. But I think it is up to Republicans to hammer home, not just appealing to the unfairness of it all, but to hit the message that she has been on this side of the issue for this long. And I think by appealing to fairness and trying to work the refs, okay, there's a value to that. You can fire up your side. But if you're not out there showing the clip, I mean, there was a moment there where I think, President Trump was out there at rallies kind of showing, clips of Kamala Harris. They can't ignore that, right, when you hammer that home. But there's been an inconsistency with that. I mean, we can talk all day about media bias and media unfairness, and it's true, but it's baked in, and we've always known that. That's
right. I always say that, like Republicans, you start in a credibility deficit with the media just because you're a Republican, which means you could whine about it, or you can just recognize that and then work so much harder. I always say corporate America should hire Republican communicators because I guarantee they had to work so much harder than their Democrats. Now, the White House press corps, the current White House press team might disagree with that for the last month and a half they've had because of Biden. And certainly if you ask the Hillary Clinton team, they think the New York Times is the worst thing that ever happened to them. But overall, I think that you and I are correct.
But to your point, in terms of the last month and a half they had with Biden, if there were any lessons to be learned, it should have been that they should have been more curious earlier on. And so you've gone from very credulous and deferential to the administration to frenzy of the month or whatever it was as we sort of pushed Biden out. And then on the other end of this, we're back to this credulous, oh, that sounds nice, let's just print what they say sort of approach, which, look, I'm not surprised by it. It is frustrating as a Republican and for Republicans, but you have to drive the message and be relentless. Any opportunity you have for earned media when you're out there on the Sunday shows. I think J.D. Vance did a pretty good job.
He did. I thought he did. And it was sort of interesting because you said they had 3 weeks where they could have done interviews and they didn't do it. But when Vance did interviews on 3 different Sunday shows yesterday, it was like, well, he answered the tough questions. He was there. He was calm, thoughtful. You might disagree with him, but at least he did it.
Exactly. And I think that was always obviously he was picked for a different race. He was picked for a different moment in the campaign, but he's always going to give you the Trump take in an articulate way that Trump probably couldn't be able to stay on message and discipline. It is a good use case, and they should have been doing it sooner. I expect them to do it throughout. But it's been frustrating to watch as a Republican, just as a professional, thinking, okay, guys, you got to be out there. And it's not as if the material's not there. I mean, within a day, you had campaigns, and Senate campaigns, like for instance in Pennsylvania, like coming up with perfect spots that packaged these hits against Harris, and we just haven't seen it. And part of that, as I said, look, bombarding Harris in August when people are on vacation or watching the Olympics or what have you. I mean, I guess at some level, putting that on air on the Olympics has some logic to it. I saw some Harris Walls ads, but okay, it makes sense perhaps to train your fire until September when people really tune in. That said, this was such a key stretch for Harris to shake the Etch-a-Sketch and reboot herself that I think it's a real missed opportunity. You can't do anything about it now, but you really have to take these final 85 days seriously. And as I'm sure we'll talk about, that's for Election Day. But voting starts significantly sooner than that. So really, we're talking about 2 months before the real action begins.
Yes, before we get to that, because I do want to ask you about early voting. I want to ask you about this. I have a feeling. I think that the Republicans are building up Kamala Harris's first media interview or first press conference to be way too much. Like, they assume it's going to be a disaster. It could be. If past as prologue, maybe it will be a disaster. But this is a woman who's shown she can rise to the occasion. And we also know that she'll probably pick a reporter or a journalist who is maybe gentle in terms of the questioning. Maybe not, but I just think that can't be the only thing that they're waiting on in order to go after her.
I think you're exactly right. And quite frankly, we have, this is sort of the counterfactual of not managing expectations very well with Joe Biden. And of course, it worked out fine insofar as when he had the disastrous debate that he did, it was undeniable to the point where it actually moved too quickly and knocked him out, right out of the gate. But I think in terms of, you have to manage those expectations, and you have to assume that the lower that you set the bar and the more that you build up the sort of tension, the easier it is to glide over it. And as you said, for the same reasons, if you don't trust the media to hold her account now, I don't know why you'd trust them to be the arbiters of whether she cleared that bar. So I do think there's a risk to building that up too much. It's important. They do need to start answering those questions and getting her off in unscripted moments, because the reason she was considered a top tier candidate in 2020 in that election cycle, the reason she was even picked to be vice president, she is good at set plays. Mm-hmm. She's not great in a position where she has to, do some extemporaneous speaking or speak to issues that she's not properly prepared for. But as you said, as they ease into this, they will be given credit just for sitting down in the first place, just for giving media access in the first place.
And then you take away that point. Yeah. And actually, so just so everybody knows, as we're catching folks up here, there will be we know that there is one scheduled debate where we're waiting to see if there will be more. It will be September 10th. I believe that's a Tuesday. So yes, it's a Tuesday. So that's on ABC News. So we have that. I did want to ask you about this. I was trying to follow the Tim Walz military. Did he lie? Did he not lie? Did he serve well? Did he not serve honorably? Or not, leave?
Yeah.
Did he embellish? Or did he lie about his military record? How do you think that is shaping out?
Well, look, I think first and foremost, the problem here is this is not the top of the ticket. And so even if you prove this case slam dunk, at best what you're going to get out of this is proof that Kamala Harris is a bad decision maker. Like, it's not going to be the sort of hit it would have been against John Kerry, as we say. Like, so the swift boat concept of how this might play out is fundamentally flawed in the sense that you're just focused on the wrong guy at the time when you need to be focused on Kamala Harris. Now, the week of the Tim Walz rollout, it's fair to be hitting this story, and obviously it's gotten some traction. Look, it's murky. He clearly has benefited from the impression that he did not correct, that he was perhaps more valorous in his service than he was, the circumstances of his exit. But this stuff's been litigated at the small level. This has been litigated at the Minnesota level, at the congressional level, at the statewide gubernatorial level 2 times. And so there is something there that you can gin up the base on. This is not going to be any kind of knockout blow. So I think you need to understand what it is, what it's useful for. I think that's the limit to it is, even if you give the best form of the case and couch it in the proper ways, all you can do is a bank shot hit on Kamala Harris. And at the end of the day, you need to define her. And it's one thing to say, okay, this is bad decisions, and she picks another kind of shape-shifting guy you can't trust. As long as that circles back to your message against her, that's fine, but you can't get too invested in what's ultimately a red herring.
All right, then let me ask you this last question before we take a quick break, which is, what do we know about the get out the vote and voter registration efforts of both parties? Because early voting begins September 6th, less than a month away in North Carolina.
It does. Those absentee ballots go out within a month. The in-person, I mean, here in Virginia, we're I think 5 weeks away from, or maybe 5.5 weeks away from being there voting in person. It is coming. It is coming fast. Look, I think part of what's tricky is, as this race has changed, the terrain has changed as well. You had mid-July, the Trump campaign talking about they're going to open all these offices in Minnesota and Virginia, in places that were, for a fleeting moment, seemed like they were in play. Suddenly they're not places you should be investing. So I do think in that sense, there's been a little bit of a shift to the ground beneath us. The Democratic machine is certainly more focused on these sorts of get out the vote efforts. I think with Republicans and with Trump, what they've been trying to message, and you saw it a lot at the RNC, was trying to unwind some of the rhetoric they've hurt themselves with regard to absentee, early voting, those sorts of things. I think voting any way you can, as soon as you can.
Yeah, I mean,
it's
funny because President Trump, I think he knows that he should say that people should do voting whenever they can, that they have to match the Democrats point by point. And then they want them to vote early. And then every once in a while, like at a rally, he'll say, and they're going to steal the election because nobody can trust the early ballots. And I think that in his gut, he doesn't actually believe that it's going to be fair.
I think that's right, and it's that constant tension, and it's, I mean, for him, there's the sort of angel and devil on your shoulder. I don't know if maybe it's just Susie Wiles on his shoulder, but a commitment to winning and understanding that he needs to do what he needs to do, all else aside, I think is going to be what this comes down to. I mean, he did a great job of staying out of the way, letting the election being about Biden. Now we're finally seeing the first sense of adversity, and this is going to be a question of how the campaign responds. But I do think that him keeping with that message, or at least not stepping on that message, is going to be absolutely critical. Enthusiasm is suddenly, instead of that asymmetry of Dems being bummed out and Republicans being fired up, now everybody's pretty fired up, and that is fine and a good place to be. But it's not how you're going to win this election. You're going to have to ratchet up your efforts, hit these high notes, and get people fired up around who this ticket is. And negative polarization is such a all Democrats had before was orange man bad. Suddenly they have something that they're fired up about to the positive. I think getting Republicans in a similar way, you need that kind of split screen of Kamala Harris is a San Francisco liberal, or she's a flip-flopper or whatever. Fine, that's good. But you need to have some forward-looking message of why it's important to get Trump back in there and make America great again.
All right, we will have more Perino on politics coming up. And we are back with Perino on politics. Liam, one of the things that I thought about with some distance of daily commentating last week was that I just feel that because it's so horse race focused, and the media whitewashing Kamala Harris's previous record and position on the issues, that what about the issues? And I thought this was very interesting. Of course, we hear repeatedly from voters, the economy is the number one issue. Crime and border being also very high. But on the economy, there's a new poll that was just out that Harry Enden of CNN was just pointing to, which is that for the first time, the Democrat, in this case it's Harris, has overtaken Trump on who people trust more on the most important issue, and that's the economy. And yet she hasn't said one word about the economy yet, except for taking Trump's idea not to tax tips. What's going on?
So the Harry clip is interesting because, and they kind of had a colloquy on this, the way it was phrased was not on the economy. It was on the thing that you care about most. And so that was a self-selective question of, it's because it's dynamic. That's what's so interesting about it. I think, to your point, maybe there is some,
I see. So some people, their number one issue could be abortion, and they're saying her.
But exactly, and
Okay.
What's interesting there to me beneath the surface, and it's hard to discern, but the issue matrix shifting is going to be really critical, because if the economy is less important, or maybe more other things are more important, that makes sense in terms of the shift. To some degree, to your point, though, people don't hold the economy and inflation against Harris in the way that they were holding it against Biden.
Yeah.
So the Trump number, if you notice, even in that CNN poll, let's just assume it's all economy. The Trump number is the same. What changes is that Biden was way down here, and Harris comes up to about 50%. And that's a function of the slack. And I think that tells you the story of all these polls. Trump is pretty much even, Steven, in terms of his vote share. And look, I think if I could say one thing, and I would have said it a year ago, especially with Donald Trump, watch the vote share. Forget about the margin. The vote share is what matters.
So we try to keep this at a pretty high level. What does that mean?
So if you hear in this or that poll that Donald Trump is up 2 or Kamala Harris is up 3, that's less important than where Donald Trump is in a given state or nationally. Because if they're, 1 or 2 behind in the low 40s, that's a huge amount of undecided voters or slack that will ultimately be consolidated. The question is, when you get up into the high 40s and diminishing returns, particularly for somebody like Trump, who's a high floor and a low ceiling, that's where it becomes much more of an issue. But the reason I raise this is, in that previous iteration of the poll, Biden's down at 40, Trump's at, let's say, 50. But the delta there is just people who aren't so sure. They're not crazy about either of them. And ultimately, they're going to go one side or the other. And what we've seen is, okay, you swap out Biden, and people who were for various reasons mad at him are not holding that against Harris. And that goes back to Republicans need to drive that message against her. She was the deciding vote, as the only job you have as vice president is casting that deciding vote in the Senate. And guess what? She did that for every major piece of legislation. That's great.
Including the one that was the cause of inflation.
Exactly. The $2 trillion American Rescue Plan. That's great if you like those things. But to the extent that voters, blame that for inflation, if you're Republicans, you have to be hammering that message home. She owns neither the Biden record that they should be hitting her on, nor her previous record, for the reason that you mentioned, Dana, because they're able to say, well, she doesn't believe that anymore. She doesn't have to say that. But somebody's saying, well, she doesn't believe that anymore. She actually
thing is, I'm okay with people changing their mind, but it would say, then why?
And
Madam Vice President, why have you changed your opinion on this? I'm just curious why. And we don't get any of that.
None of it. And I think that was one of the things that came up in the round of Vance interviews was, people are hammering him on what was a significant change. He said a lot of things that he no longer believes, and he's had to explain that at length, understandably and for good reason. But no one has done that for Kamala Harris. We might expect that will happen when she finally sits down, but that's going to be in a controlled environment with a very friendly audience. And the fact that she's been able to get away with it thus far is both an indictment of the media, but also of the Republican campaign against her, which has been non-existent.
So I spent a little bit of time with some younger people, and by that I mean late 20s, early 30s, trying to get their lives going. They've been given promotions, or they're starting new businesses. They're starting to figure out how can they buy a home. Their car insurance is way up. And I think that for me, inflation, yes, groceries are expensive, but I feel like the affordability, I don't want to call it a crisis necessarily, though it feels like a crisis, I think, for some of them. And I believe that it's like we're asking these younger people as a country to run a marathon with 20-pound weights on their ankles. And I don't know what you think about that, but just as a last point here before we have a quick break, my gut instinct is that that's really driving a lot of people's anxiety. And they might not think that Trump or Kamala Harris is going to help them with that. They just seem to think that government does not help them. They feel like it's a hindrance.
I think that's absolutely true, and I say that as sort of the elder side of the millennial demographic. I'm somebody that I've been able to start a family. I've been able to take advantage and sort of build that American dream. But my sister is in that cohort that you're talking about, and it's just much harder. As hard as it has been for my generation generally, at the time that we've come of age, it is much harder if you are on the tail end here, if those are the things that you want to do, build a family or attain home ownership. We've been set back so far, and to your point, I think to the extent that you're even engaging in politics, and I think there's a lot of reasons that my generation has been really disgusted by the whole thing. We're now in prime voting age, and I think that goes back to one of the reasons that Biden was having such a hard time, because Donald Trump, one way or another, was kind of the change candidate in the sense that the status quo is bad. And so, well, it can't be any worse than this. And I kind of remember when things were okay pre-COVID. That's not the case right now, because Harris has managed to kind of get on all sides of every issue where, yeah, she nominally represents the administration and the president, but she's not currently that baggage has not held her down, and so she looks and sounds younger. She looks and sounds different. So to the extent that she can be all things to all people and promise change, I think those sorts of voters might be compelled by that, as long as they don't hold this against her. And I think that goes back to the need of Republicans to tie her fully to the Biden administration, to the Biden policies, not let her out of that, because right now she's just able to be a blank canvas to project onto. I
saw this. I'll end on this. There was a meme going around on the internet this weekend about the Olympics, and it was talking about buying a house in 1976 versus today, and it showed a video of Nadia Comaneci on the floor doing her floor routine at the Olympics in the gymnastics category, and then you saw Simone Biles doing her gymnastics routine, and the difficulty with which Simone Biles has to achieve in order just to get that same gold medal was very telling. I thought that was just a great way for them to put it. And of course, I got that sent to me by one of these young people. All right, we will be right back with more Perino on Politics. Okay, Liam, this is a short segment. I just want to do two things. I always ask, what do you think I might be missing, or what do you pay attention to at this point with 85 days left to go in the race that I should pay attention to?
Well, I think I'm not sure that it's going to come into focus necessarily in the last 85 days, but I think just taking stock of the policy stakes here is just tremendously important. To the extent that you're seeing policy seep into the debates, you're seeing President Trump throw out there the no tips, no taxes on tips, and Kamala Harris kind of following him on there.
Yeah, and he's like, stop copying me.
Yeah, right, exactly. The next one I think is trying not to tax Social Security benefits. That's all fine and interesting and good politics to the extent that that's the goal. What it doesn't take into account is just to ensure that no one pays any more taxes. We need to somehow come up with $4 trillion, $4.6 trillion next year to forestall a pretty significant fiscal cliff here. All that notwithstanding the growing debt and deficit, the fact that we need to raise the debt limit in the second quarter of next year. So I think just thinking about the fiscal stakes of all this, not only is that an element of it, so that's the mostly Trump tax cuts there, but there's also the intersection of the last two previous presidents or previous Democrat presidents and their signature legislation. You have the Affordable Care Act premium support coming up again. You have a significant inflection point in President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act and the clean energy regime that ushers in. All these things are open for business, open heart surgery on the tax code and our fiscal policy of our country. Nobody's talking about that yet, but the balance of power that's going to be, presiding over that next year is critically important. As we talked about, I think there's reason to think that Republicans will have one lever of power, particularly in the Senate. It might not have a lot of, it might not be a significant majority, but that means you're not going to have carte blanche for a Harris administration to do whatever they want. That's going to be tough. It's going to be challenging. Republicans have a pretty good chance, if Donald Trump can turn it around, at having all three levers of power that are relevant. Yeah. What Republicans can do with that power is still the question. It was the question back in 2017. It took them time to get on top of things. But I think that's what I'm watching here in Washington. That is something that is not lost on Republican congressional leaders. They are doing a lot of work here, even over the summer here, trying to get on the same page, trying to figure out what the policies would be. In 2016, they were the dog that caught the car, and I think wasted a lot of opportunity there in 2017. Yeah. They're not going to have that happen again. So I think that's what I'm watching, certainly over the next 6 months. So
you answered my question, but you also answered one of the social media questions that I asked for. So let me ask you this. This is from Starry. What blue 2020 state is most likely to flip to red And then also ask, what about red to blue, if any? And I would include your state there, Virginia.
Yeah, I think blue to red, the most obvious ones would have been the Sunbelt states, the Georgias and the Arizonas. I do think Harris has put those back in play in a way that they weren't. I mean, the Biden path was singularly focused on the blue wall, but I still do think those are, for a variety of reasons, more attainable for Trump. I would expect it to sort of, I would say, probably Arizona first, Nevada second, pretty close there. And then you're getting into ranking of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, probably in that order, but it's looking kind of shaky there. But I would say the Sunbelt states have the most room to grow and snap back from 2020. In terms of the other direction, I think there's reason that even with Biden, there was bullishness among Democrats on North Carolina. Since 2008, when President Obama won it, it has been the one that Democrats could not win any which way. They've won it. The Democratic governor there has won 2 elections. They feel pretty good about the gubernatorial election there. That's actually one of the reasons that Biden was targeting it, because the lieutenant governor there, Mark Robinson, is known for making bombastic comments, and there's reason to think that the suburbs might not be on board with him. The idea of reverse coattails, I think, is hard to imagine. But I think the question is, can Harris get those young African-American, Hispanic, diverse voters to come back to the fold, put back together that coalition, and jack up the volume to the point where they can get over the hump in North Carolina in the way that they missed in 2020 and they missed in 2016. But I think by a significant margin, North Carolina is the most likely to flip. I wouldn't say it's likely to flip, but it's certainly more likely than the next tier. The Texases and the Floridas, those just aren't going to happen.
The fool's gold of Texas for
exactly.
Democrats. All right, Liam Donovan, you're amazing. Is that a Green Bay Packers shirt?
This is a Georgetown Hoyas shirt.
Oh, all I could see was the G. Georgetown Hoyas. That's why I don't do Perino Reads Sports. It's Perino on Politics, and I'm glad you were my guest. Liam Donovan, thank you.
Thanks, Dana.
Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.